Hello, I'm Robert, voluntary fact checker, and helping you if you're scared of many things. So this helps you to understand why it is very, very safe to permit Ukraine to fire its weapons across the border into Russia. I don't know of anyone, nobody has shared any example of any war in which the invaded country was not permitted by its weapons suppliers to use its weapons back against the country that was invading it. Ukraine has every right to do this under Article 59 of the UN Charter. Indeed, it is Russia that is breaking international law by firing its weapons from Russia into Ukraine as the invader. Ukraine, as the defender, has every right to fire back, but Russia, as the invader, has no right to fire its weapons into Ukraine. That is the current legal situation there. So it's totally normal and not escalatory for its weapons suppliers to permit it to fire back over the border where its border is a front line. Just exercising its legitimate right to self-defense under the UN Charter. Now, according to the New York Times, if they got this right, the US administration is debating whether to let Ukraine and use its shells and other missiles across the border to hit targets in Russia. So why has this come up now, 2 years into the war? Well, in 2022, Ukraine didn't have any NATO shells. It was using its own shells. It only took, at the very beginning, all it had was the Javelin anti-tank missiles and the Stingers. And then very, very slowly, eventually, US gave it the HIMARS. It didn't give it shells and its howitzers until quite late into 2022. By then, all the attacks across the border had stopped. So this is the first time since 2022 that Russia has attacked Ukraine across its border. And this made it really, really clear how bizarre the situation is. So if you come down here, look at this. This is Wolfshank, and you may have heard people talking about how incredibly fast Russia has moved. It's not that fast. It's just fast compared to the very, very slow pace in Donbass. It managed to move 5 kilometers in a week or so. That's not very fast, just a few fields. But the reason it could do that is because of this bizarre restriction. This was the front line. The border, that's Russia and that's Ukraine. And this is the border between the two. Then the Ukrainians could see large numbers of soldiers and artillery and all the offensive gear lining up on the Russian side of the border, all ready to invade. And they could do nothing because they are completely out of their Soviet era shells. They've got lots now of the US shells because they've got to the front line, but they can't use them across the border. So they just had to wait for the Russians to cross the border. Then the Russians are now right at the outskirts here, and they couldn't build fortifications here. They can't build fortifications till at least 8 kilometers from the front line, because it's just impossible to do that, because as soon as you start digging, the Russians are going to fire shells across the border and hit you. Their front line is 12 kilometers away from the border just because of this artificial rule. Otherwise we'd be right at the border. So now you're a Ukrainian soldier here, and you've got these M777 howitzers, and they have a range of 30 kilometers. There is a Russian artillery there, say a Grad or something, got a range of 50 kilometers, and you're well within range of it. It's just lobbing shells one after another, hundreds of them, into Wolfshank. It's just across the border, and it's completely safe. With your M777 howitzers, you've got to stop the range down to less than 5 kilometers, just short of where that Grad is firing its bombs at you, or the other, whatever artillery they've got there, firing shells into Vovshank. So this is why it's become really, really clear. And we've got Mike Johnson, who is not the Speaker of the House in the US, and he is not as he was the one who was really holding back on passing the US-Ukraine bill. But now that it's passed, he's saying this is bonkers. Now they've got our shells, you must permit them to fire back across the border into Russia. And Mike Johnson says that. Then there's Boris Johnson, ex-Prime Minister, David Cameron, ex-UK Prime Minister. There's all sorts of people. There's the head of NATO, there's the head of the UK Armed Forces, lots of people all saying exactly the same message. There's no legal, no legitimate reason for telling these Ukrainian soldiers, and you could tell Ukrainian soldiers, they follow these instructions. They follow whatever the US tells them are the restrictions. They follow them very carefully. So they're just not going to fire any shells across the border until the US gives them permission. And so they just have to try the best they can to defend Vovshank when they're being shelled all the time, and also the glide bombs from the Russian jets dropping glide bombs into Vovshank, and the shells flying over the border. And all they can do is sit there and hope they don't get hit by one of the shells, and then try and fire back at the Russians as soon as they cross the border into Ukraine. It just makes no military sense whatsoever. And it's got, as I said, it's got the UN Charter back to front. Russia is the country that, Russia as the invader, is a country that should be prohibited from attacking Ukraine. Ukraine as the defender, its country has a legitimate right to self-defense. And Ukraine always stops at the international border. This is from May 16, 2022, when Ukraine liberated part of Kharkiv Oblast. And they just stopped, and they've put in the boundary marker, and they had a celebratory photo shot of them symbolically putting in the boundary marker reinstating it between Ukraine and Russia. It didn't take even 1 meter of Russian soil when they did that. So, for those of you who are in the United States, I thought I'd use this example of the war between United States and Canada, when United States decided in 1812 that it would liberate the Canadians from the British. But the Canadians didn't want to be liberated. So it's really not that different from this current situation where Ukrainians don't want to be liberated. In this case, just from Ukraine, not even from another country. So Russia is claiming to liberate the Ukrainians from their legitimate elected Ukrainian government. And the Ukrainians don't want to be liberated. Not even the ones that support Putin or that support Russia ahead, not even the ones that support Russia and want close integration with Russia, they do not want to be liberated from Zelensky. Many of them voted for Zelensky, who is a Russian speaker himself and was born in the Russian-speaking area of Ukraine. So if we go back to the war in 1812, the USA tried to invade Canada, and for instance across this river, the St. Mary's River, between Michigan and Ontario. And when it did that, Canada fired back. And back then, of course, they had a very limited range, 1,100 yards. But do you think that the British should have told the Canadians, don't fire your cannon across the river into the United States? Of course they shouldn't do that. Now, in the end, that war did turn up into actually the British, they took bits of the United States back from the United States in the course of that war. And then they actually attacked from the south as well, from where Mexico is now. And they took bits of the United States from the south there as well. To end up in a great big war and them advancing both ways. But with Ukraine, as I've said, the Ukrainians, they just stop at the international border. They're not taking anything from Russia. They just stop exactly at the border. And this is to ensure, because the UN Charter didn't exist back then, the time of the 1812 war. It didn't exist in the time of World War II, but it does now. It was designed to end world wars. And one of the things it says is that you have legitimate right to protect against an invasion. You do not have a legitimate right to invade anyone else. So Putin, with his propaganda, tries to frame it as an attempt by NATO to attack Russia, but that fails the most basic fact check. NATO's weren't helping Ukraine, even if it's fighting against separatists in Donbass in any way. They supplied it with, the USA gave them a few Javelin anti-tank missiles, which were no use against Donbass because the separatists didn't have tanks. And then very shortly before Russia invaded, but there were these tanks marching up and down outside Ukraine with the Russians. And then shortly before, and of course the separatists didn't have fighter jets or helicopters, and shortly before the invasion, Latvia and Lithuania gave Ukraine some Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which will only be useful against Russians with low-flying fighter jets and helicopters. So none of this was to help with the war against the separatists in Donbass. So there was no attempt by NATO to try to get Ukraine to attack Russia in any way. So then Putin, he keeps claiming that he is going to attack the UK. He claimed when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, he claimed that he was going to do a nuclear attack against them if they did that, with his vague threats. He didn't actually say the word nuclear, but he said he was going to retaliate against them. And it was so serious that the United Kingdom gave Sweden its reassurances that it would extend its nuclear umbrella over Sweden and over Finland until they became NATO members, as an independent country, not as part of NATO, because of Putin's nuclear threats against Sweden and Finland when they made the decision to join NATO. And of course, Putin didn't use nukes against them. None of his red lines have ever been serious. They're just bluffs. Bluff, 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 bluff. All the way through. And these are all the people that are reminding us that Ukraine has a legitimate right. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, Boris Johnson, ex-UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, and many others. But those are ones that I thought I'd quote from in this debunk. Now, the New York Times article, it has this very misleading photograph. It claimed that this was the result of a Ukrainian attack on Russia, and it shows an obviously civilian apartment block which had been destroyed by a bomb. Ukraine never does that. And there are no examples of any civilian apartment blocks in Russia that have been damaged by Ukraine. And so this is something that Russia has done quite often. It's happened ever since the war, since 2022. From time to time, its bombers accidentally drop bombs in Russian territory. It's happened many times. Perhaps the pilots aren't very experienced, perhaps it's a maintenance issue, whatever reason, it's happened numerous times. And this was one of those examples. The open source intelligence looking at this, and they are pretty clear that what this was, because for one thing, it hit the apartment blocks from the Russian side rather than the Ukrainian side. And they're pretty clear, certain, that this was a glide bomb that was dropped accidentally too soon by a Russian fighter jet on Belgorod. So this is one of these experts, and he just said shoddy is one word to describe this. To call this when all there were lots of people discussing that online, and they said this is obviously not Ukraine, it must be Russia. And they looked and they checked, and the details are very clear that this was a Russian mistake. Not intentional. They weren't attacking their own civilians, they just made a mistake. And then, rather than admit to the mistake, they claimed that Ukraine did it. So this is about why it doesn't make the USA into competent. So oh yeah, it's just going back to the Canada thing. That if with a country that supplied Canada with weapons to defend itself from USA have to tell Canadians they can't use them against USA, of course not. I think I've already talked about that. So, and I'll come to that in a minute, about how vastly outmatched USA is by UK technologically. If he does not want to get, so you see all these attempts by Putin to prevent the NATO from supplying ancient technology. So the ATACMS, that's from the 1980s. The F-16 fighter jet is from the 1970s. And Putin, they are more than a match for Russia's best air defense systems, and the F-16 is equal to Russia's very best fighter jets today, and far better than the MiG-29 which the Ukraine has, which is an older fighter jet from the Soviet era. So Russia is constantly bluffing to try and make sure that NATO doesn't send ancient, decades-old gear into Ukraine for Ukraine to use, because it is equivalent to roughly what Russia has today as its very best, most modern missile weapons. So it's obvious that Putin does not want NATO to get involved. This Tomahawk cruise missile, these F-35s, they are the fourth generation fighter jet, and Russia is still on the 3.5. And meanwhile, NATO is working on its fifth generation fighter jets. Russia is still nowhere near its fourth generation fighter jet. It's that far behind. It's really, really far behind now. During the Cold War, under the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union had a much larger defense base. It included East Germany, which of course is now part of Germany and part of NATO. It included Ukraine, which was a very major defense area that made things like the ICBMs were made in Ukraine, and they were to do with the nuclear. Well, a lot of the nuclear missiles were in Ukraine, and Russia now is a much smaller country with a much lower GDP, and it's also got its oligarchs that siphon away a lot of its wealth. So it's impossible for Russia to catch up now with NATO. So it's nothing to do with the brilliance or otherwise of scientists and soldiers on either side, just because of the oligarchs and because of its GDP and its problems with its economy that it's had for decades. So now this is what Stoltenberg said. Let's see. Self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter. It's legal, it's legitimate, and we help Ukraine with upholding that right. And that should include the ability to also strike targets on Russian territory when the military legitimate targets we're talking about. I made these into points which make it a bit easier for some of my readers. So his main points were that the Allies need to leave these restrictions now that fighting is going on close to the border in Kharkiv. It's very hard for Ukraine to defend itself, as we saw, when the front line is only 5 kilometers away and you're not allowed to fire over the front line. How can you defend yourself? And Ukraine has the right to defend itself, and that includes its striking targets in Russian territory. He also makes the point that some allies, like the UK, have already lifted this restriction. But the US is the most important ally that needs to lift it. And then he makes this point that I made, that in Kharkiv, the border between Russia and Ukraine is also the battlefield front line. So it makes no sense to prevent the defender from firing weapons across the front line into the invader's side of the front line. So if you don't give Ukraine permission to fire its weapons over the Russian side of the front line, it's very hard for Ukraine to defend itself. And that is why Russia advanced a few kilometers quite quickly, because it was impossible for Ukraine to fire back until it got quite a way back into Ukrainian territory. Then it was under cover from the shells from Russia, and very little that Ukraine could do. And then he just said what I just said, that self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter and that should include the ability to hit legitimate defensive targets. There's a transcript of the whole thing. And he had to speak for the House, Mike Johnson, and he said, I think they need to allow Ukraine to prosecute the war in the way it sees fit, and they need to be able to fight back. And he thinks us trying to micromanage the effort there, it's not a good policy for us. And that is the Speaker of the House, the one who was so reluctant to pass any funding for Ukraine. But now that it's gone there, he just said the House made no such restriction. This is the thing Congress keeps saying to Biden. We have funded these weapons for Ukraine, and we did not require them to only hit targets in Ukraine. So please lift this restriction. It's not a restriction from Congress, it's a restriction from the President only. So that's what the US is saying. And so there's united front in Congress, really, saying that you need to lift this restriction. They're telling the President, lift this restriction, it's not a requirement from Congress. So I think it's pretty clear that with all this pressure, Biden is sure to lift it, but he might still take weeks before he does that, because he has been very, very slow at doing things like this. He is ultra cautious, more cautious even than Germany. Well, no, maybe originally Germany was much more cautious, but I think Germany is still probably a bit more cautious that it hasn't given its Taurus missiles and US has given its ATACMS. So yeah, I'd say Germany is slightly more cautious than US, but US is the next most cautious after Germany. Here's the Helsinki Commission, here's Boris Johnson, given them weapons, absolutely ludicrous that Ukrainians should be forbidden from what Putin is doing himself in attacking Ukrainian forces. Why on earth shouldn't Ukrainians be able to attack Russian forces mustering on their borders? Like they've been there for weeks, mustering on the borders. They have to do that to get ready for the attack. Then they need to muster. Normally they would try and do it secretly in woods or something to try and hide their activities. But Russia can just do it openly on the other side of the border because Ukraine can't fire back. How does that make sense? And now this is an example. So if Putin was permitted to do so, if he thought he could get away with it, he would tell Ukraine that they must use historically accurate Roman chariots to fight against him. His red lines as arbitrary and ludicrous as requiring them to use historically accurate Roman chariots. There's nothing in international law, there's nothing in ethically, there's nothing politically, there's nothing that makes any sense with his red lines, any of them that he's made during this law. And now this is an example to show how when Putin's red lines are crossed, so he was originally saying you must not attack Crimea. And then gradually, bit by bit, Ukraine attacked Crimea more and more, and Russia just ignored all the attacks on Crimea. The first one was 2022 with the Saki airfield. And the Russian people were looking at it, and they uploaded things on the internet about it being hit. And Russia just downplayed it and said it's an explosion on the airfield or something. They've never admitted that the Ukrainians hit Saki airfield. Just a smoking accident or something. It gradually became more and more clear during the war that just they couldn't hide it, but they don't announce it. They don't acknowledge these attacks on Russian television. So eventually the headquarters in Sevastopol was destroyed, was damaged so much that Ukraine had to leave it. Eventually the Russian fleet in Sevastopol harbour, which was a big success of Putin when he captured Crimea in 2014, that was to get Crimea. They already had some control of Sevastopol before 2014. And this was their big military base on the Black Sea, and was how they were able to bully Ukraine and prevent it from exporting grain. But Ukraine forced, just using missiles, without any destroyers at all, forced Russia out of Sevastopol harbour last year. This is one of its its successes last year when it hit the Rostov-on-Don, the I think was that the name, the Russian nuclear submarine from the Black Sea. It can't get submarines from anywhere else because Turkey will not let it through the Bosporus Strait. So this is one of its very few subs that it's got left in the Black Sea, was destroyed by a Storm Shadow missile, which was supplied to Ukraine by the UK. And that's going back spring last year, I think it was. What does Russia do? Nothing. It'll be just the same whenever there'll be, at some point, there'll be a similar dramatic story in Belgorod Oblast or something, where a Storm Shadow has destroyed some dramatic target in Belgorod Oblast with the UK Storm Shadow. Putin will not attack UK. That makes absolutely no sense. He'll just not mention it on the Russian news programs, whatever it is that happens. That's how he responds. And then, just a point of clarity, that being competent does not mean your country will be targeted. The UK has been a combatant in numerous wars, last century and this century. And in none of those wars has it ever been attacked. Even when it was fighting against Argentina, when Argentina attacked the Falkland Islands, that was UK territory in the southern hemisphere. But Argentina didn't even think of trying to attack the United Kingdom. So when the UK, even if the UK was to fight in Ukraine, there's no way that Putin would attack the UK. It would make absolutely no sense for him to attack the UK, even if the UK was fighting in Ukraine, which it's not going to do. It's not going to do. The UK has made it clear it's not going to do that, but not because they're worried about Putin attacking UK, because he wouldn't. The reason they're doing it, they don't want to fight in the UK, is because Ukraine has plenty of its own soldiers. If it was somewhere like Moldova, the UK would be over there fighting. But because it is Ukraine, which has got plenty of soldiers, it does not have a shortage of soldiers to use the UK weapons, then the UK has no plans to fight in Ukraine. But if it was, suppose it was Moldova, which is insulated by Ukraine and Russia can't get to it. But if it was a country like Moldova, not part of NATO, and Russia was attacking it, and the UK wanted to defend it, it would just send its soldiers there. And there's no way that Russia would attack the UK in that situation. So, but the UK is not. The UK is not involved. No NATO countries are involved. In fact, indeed, no other country is fighting in Ukraine except Ukraine. It is able to hold off Russia all by itself, with all it needs are the weapons. And this goes into some of the details as to how that's possible. So, because you might think, well, how can Ukraine, so much smaller than Russia, have a big enough army to fight Russia? Well, the thing is that Ukraine is in a war economy. It's spending a fifth of its GDP on the war. And it's got 42 million people. Of those, 900,000 are soldiers. Russia has 144 million, and of those, less than 1% are soldiers, 1.32 million. Whereas that's more like, that's about 2% for Ukraine, 2 or 3%, 2% I think, 42, a bit over 2%, whereas Russia is less than 1%. So although Russia has more than 3 times the population, it only has a slightly larger army. And the Ukrainian army is far better equipped with much better equipment and much better trained. And for instance, Russia has 10 times as many fighter jets as Ukraine. And yet, even back in 2022, when Ukraine had no air defences to speak of, no Patriot, just the Stinger missiles, Russia was not able, and those were only useful against very low-flying jets. Russia was not able to take over the Ukrainian airspace, even with 10 times as many fighter jets and 10 times as many 4,000 military aircraft altogether. And yet, even with 4,000 aircraft against a few dozen, Russia was not able to take over the Ukrainian airspace. And NATO was very puzzled by that. But it turns out that Russia is using tactics that belong back to World War II. The pilots are not given any independence. They just do what their commander tells them. They have these big flying airborne command stations that tell them what to do, and they say, go and drop a bomb there. And they fly over Ukraine to wherever it is, and then they drop a bomb, then they fly back again, just like in World War II. And they have not trained in how to work together to take over an enemy airspace. They simply don't know how to do it. So the Ukrainian pilots are trained with NATO training. They have been for the last decade or so, and it's just not possible for Russia to catch up on that in so short a period of time. So that is why the Ukrainian pilots are so much better than the Russian ones, because they're using modern techniques. And Russia is stuck in what is basically World War II techniques, and they've never, in any of their wars, had to learn how to do better than that. And then if you look at the defense spending, then Russia is spending 6% of its GDP. Ukraine is spending 22%, and with that, even with its very small GDP, it's managing to do more than a third of the funding of the Russian war effort, just from Ukraine itself. And then the NATO and the allies, their total defense spending is vastly more. Its European allies are spending 380 billion, which is much more than Ukraine, than Russia. So you can see how they have a much bigger defense industrial base, and that's partly why Russia can't keep up with technologically. And so, and then they've got far, far better weapons. And so this is Putin. He's basically like blowing soap bubbles at NATO. He wouldn't be able to fight them at all in a proper war. It's only able to fight Ukraine because it's got its hand tied behind its back, and it's using decades-old NATO technology, and it's not got access to the F-35s, which would achieve air supremacy very quickly. It's got a very, very small air force, and NATO is not giving it enough fighter jets to make much difference in the air. And it's gradually going to give it a few dozen F-16s, very, very slowly, over summer and into the autumn, and more of them going to 2025. But still, nowhere near the number that it has or that Russia has. So that is the reason why the war is more or less equally paced in Ukraine, because NATO is holding back, like a mammoth kind of holding back against a midget. So this is important to help you understand why it would be absolutely insane for Russia to attack NATO, and he knows this full well. A lot of Russians don't know this, but Putin certainly does. And the US and the NATO-supplied missiles, like ATACMS, they just, every day we get these news stories about how they're just going straight through and they're destroying the Russian air defences. The most modern Russian air defence is S-400. And every few days we hear about one of those being destroyed by the ATACMS now. S-400 or S-300, quite often S-400. So, and also something else of that ilk. So Ukraine is, Russia's air defences is just being shot to pieces. And they've had to move a lot of their defences from Russia itself into Ukraine, and yet they've been destroyed and having to replace more of them. They're in a very difficult situation, Russia. Few people understand and realise how very weak their air defence is, and how it's just being constantly shot to pieces. And they can't keep up. So with their tanks, then Russia's lost 3,000 tanks during the war so far. It can produce 1,500 a year now. A lot of those are reconditioned old Soviet-era tanks. It's not producing 1,500 new ones, and it's just managing to keep up with the ones that Ukraine is destroying. If Ukraine increases the number, then it will be difficult to keep up even without that supply of tanks. And now, this is to explain why the legal situation. So most of this is done under the UN Charter. That nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. Until the Security Council has taken measures, the Security Council, Russia is part of the Security Council, and it constantly vetoes any attempt to take measures against Russia. So there's no possibility of that second part of the clause being used to stop Russia from Russia as a permanent member is able to veto any resolution against it, and so it vetoes any resolution that by the Security Council to try and get Russia to stop its war. But Ukraine has the inherent right of individual collective self-defense, so it's individual self-defense in this case, against Russia. And then the UK, US and France, along with Russia. So remember I told you that Ukraine has had a large stockpile of nuclear bombs when the Soviet Union broke up. It was involved in making them and putting them onto ICBMs. And so when the Soviet Union broke up, but the defense codes were all held by Moscow, so they couldn't actually use them, but they had a huge stockpile of them. And then when the Soviet Union broke up, then on the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, Ukraine gave all its nukes back to Russia. And Russia, UK and USA wanted that. They wanted stability. They wanted the nukes to go back to Russia rather than stay in Ukraine in case they got stolen or not looked after properly, taken away to other countries or whatever. And Ukraine was quite happy for that too, but it wanted defense guarantees in response. So Ukraine asked for Russia, UK and USA all to agree not to attack or threaten Ukraine and give security assurances if it is attacked. So of course Russia has very seriously broken the Budapest Memorandum by attacking Ukraine. But the other countries are keeping to it. So the United Kingdom, France, the United States, they have a commitment to help Ukraine because it's been invaded by Russia. So they have an actual commitment under this memorandum that Russia itself signed to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia. So that is the legal situation for them. They are defending Ukraine against Russia under a memorandum that Russia itself signed with Ukraine when it gave up its nukes. And that's why they're especially vocal. That's why UK, US and France are especially vocal in support of Ukraine. And now this is an example. This shows that there's a Russian grad up there, and it's firing the missiles across the border into Ukraine from Russia. That was what I was talking about earlier on in this blog post. Now there's also a lot of confusion, and so this is another thing that scares people. There's a lot of confusion about what is meant, what the NATO treaty does. First of all, as I explained, if members from a NATO country, this is under Article 6. So the NATO treaty only applies if there's an attack on the territory of a party of the treaty. So if, suppose when Biden was in Ukraine, and suppose that Russia had accidentally or intentionally killed Biden, this would not fall under NATO, because he is in Ukraine, which is not a member of the NATO. It doesn't make any difference. The treaty is not about people who are citizens of NATO. It's just about the NATO territory and the seas that belong to NATO countries and the air above them. Forces, vessels or aircraft, when on or over these territories, in on or over these territories, or any other in Europe, where they were stationed on the date when the treaty entered into force. So that doesn't apply. That is no longer relevant, really. So just when in or over those territories, that is when it's an attack on NATO. So if the Russia was to attack, suppose Macron had done what he's not going to do, it doesn't look at all like it to do, but suppose the trainers in Ukraine, well, we know they are there unofficially, special forces training in Ukraine, but they just don't acknowledge that they're there. So they're not going to cause any problems. They're taking the risk of being killed by being there. But suppose there were trainers there officially. There's no sign of that happening, but suppose there were, and suppose they were completely protected, they would not fall under NATO. Suppose that one of them was hit, training somewhere in Ukraine, and then one of them was hit, even though they're well back from the front line, but somehow or other, trainers from NATO countries were hit by Russia. That would not fall under UN treaty because they're not in UN. And then suppose now that Russia was to attack somewhere in Ukraine. So now have I got this example? So yes, suppose Russia tried to capture a small area of NATO like Narva. It's a tiny extension of Russia, of Estonia, between Russia and the Baltic Sea. Suppose that happened. Then Narva is part of NATO, so UN treaty would apply. Estonia is a very small country which does not have much of its own military, so it would of course ask for help from NATO under Article 5. Even if Russia sent, it would have to, if it was something like Ukraine, it would be amassing tens of thousands of soldiers outside Narva, and of course at the same time the NATO countries would amass tens of thousands of soldiers within Narva to protect it. So it's tiny, it's not much bigger than a city, it's a very small area. But now suppose that it's just a little raid, right? So Russia sends a bit like what it did with Crimea. It sends just a few soldiers, unmarked soldiers, or it sends some tanks and things, just a few tanks and a few soldiers, just a little raid across the border into Narva. Then Estonia would say to NATO under Article 5, I need help. Then NATO has a 30,000 strong rapid response force, 40,000 I should say there, sorry, and that's mixed up with 300,000, and it would send about 20,000 of those right away very, very quickly. They're training every year, it circles around different countries. They're hyper alert and very ready and nimble to move because they know it's their year to defend NATO. So it circles between different countries every year. And so those would get there within a few days. The bombers, the fighter jets, they would be there in hours, I would think. And then the ones by sea would take a bit longer, and then ones that when they have to move tanks and stuff by road, it would take a bit longer, but they'd be there within days. So then Estonia would then have these 30,000 soldiers. But the most important thing, remember I said the F-35 fighter jets, I don't know if I said that with that graphic. And they are new generation fighter jets, 5th generation fighter jets. And let's go up to that graphic and show it to you. Where is it? It's a mammoth graphic. There we are. So then, imagine you're playing American football, but your team is totally invisible. That is what the F-35 jets are like. They're designed from bottom up. It's got a radar cross-section, a bit like a potato or something, tiny, tiny radar cross-section. Almost invisible. You'd never know it was a jet if you looked at the fighter at the radar. You might think it's a bird flying with something very fast, but your jets, the radar would spot something a bit bizarre if it was very, very close. Say, what's that potato doing flying at Mach 10, you know? Oh, no, not Mach 10, whatever the Mach, I don't know what the Mach, not Mach 10, that's ridiculously fast, sorry. Mach, I don't know, whether it's 2 or 3 or whatever it is, but wherever the F-35s fighter jets fly at. Sorry, I should have looked that up. But you notice if it's close up, but further away they just can't even see it. So the radar would notice something a bit bizarre, but it wouldn't really detect it as a fighter jet, because it's built from the bottom up as a totally new fighter jet with materials that are invisible to radar. Just all the details of its construction in great detail. So it's very, very hard. It's so hard to spot that the US itself can't spot its own fighter jets with its own radar. When one of their radars went missing, and the pilot had to bail out and forgot to put on his transponder, they sent out an alert to it was flying on its own under autopilot over the United States, and they knew it was going to fall down somewhere in the United States, and they sent out an alert to the general public to try and find it for it, because they couldn't track it on the radar. So it's very, very hard to spot. And Russia can't see it. It's got nothing like that. I'm sure the US is rapidly ramping up its radar capabilities too, but the US it's got no competitors that would be able to detect it. And so until very, very, very close. So that's the so go back to this idea, this crazy idea, where Russia tries to capture a small area of like Narva, and then so right away, the U.S. NATO, with its ability to achieve air supremacy, it would immediately take over the air over Narva. There's no way that Russia could do anything about that. And then it would, from above, it would deal with any radar on the ground with its HARM anti-radar systems. It would use its best missiles to hit the ground, and NATO would be using any artillery and so on. You can't imagine Russia spending long there. Their soldiers would be out of there like scolded cats. So it doesn't make sense that Russia will try to invade any of NATO. And there's a reason why they attacked Ukraine and not Lithuania. The same reason they're not going to attack somewhere like, they're just going to be out of there. They're just going to be running out of there as soon as NATO gets on the scene. We haven't seen NATO in Ukraine. We haven't seen what they can do against Russia. Nobody has ever seen what NATO can do when it faces Russia. And Russia doesn't want to find out the answer to that. And that's why it's so scared about, it's why he's putting bluffs so hard to prevent NATO sending even very ancient technology to Ukraine. He doesn't want to see what Ukraine can do with modern technology, with the most modern technology of all. Well, the Patriot air defense system, they already have that. That's shooting down just about everything, even the hypersonic missiles that Russia, Putin claimed was unstoppable. And as long as they've got enough air interceptors which they have been a bit short of recently, then Ukraine can shoot down all the hypersonic, supposedly maneuverable Kinzhal um, and Zircon attacking missiles from Russia. So, but this is not anything like that. So yes, and so now we've got the yes. So it's yes, you may have heard the proposal from Poland, which is to fire missiles, is to, if the Russian missiles are headed for Poland, then Poland wants to be able to shoot them down over Ukrainian territory before they cross over its border. And the issue there is that there's no way to know where a cruise missile is headed for, because it's programmed, but you don't know it's programmed. So if you see a cruise missile flying over Ukraine towards the Polish border, well, you know that that Russia is not attacking Poland, so it's not going to be programmed to attack Poland. But there have been a couple of mishits that have actually hit in Poland. So Poland has no way to know if this is a misprogrammed or damaged cruise missile from Russia, or whether it's going to hit a target in Ukraine. So Poland wants permission from the rest of NATO. Well, it doesn't actually really need permission under the UN treaty, but under the NATO treaty, it's just more political and politeness thing. And the rest of NATO don't want Poland to shoot them down over Ukraine. They say you just got to wait until they cross your border, and although that means some of them might land in Poland, it's a very low risk, and we just don't think you should shoot them down over Ukraine. So that is grey area. And Ukraine wants Poland to do this because it would it could protect Lviv, for instance, which is within 30 kilometers of Poland, and that is well at the point where a misfire, where Poland would want to stop a missile that might be badly programmed or might misfire and might land in Poland. So it's totally legitimate for Poland to shoot down Russian missiles over Lviv that are cruise missiles coming from Russia and heading towards Poland, because it has no idea what it's going to do. There's even been some of the Russian missiles have actually flown over Poland. One earlier last year, it flew over Poland for 39 seconds. And Poland wants permission to shoot them down when they fly over bits of Poland. So they're cruise missiles that can swerve around, they can fly anywhere they like. They don't have to travel on straight lines, and they sometimes go round in circles and go back on their target from behind. And this missile crossed over into the Polish border, where there's a little bit of an inlet of Poland into Ukraine, crossed the little inlet, and then went back into Ukrainian territory before hitting its target. And Poland wanted permission to shoot down missiles that do that. And NATO doesn't want it to do that. So this shows you how very hyper-cautious NATO is. So when Jens Stoltenberg says that it is okay to let Ukraine fire back into Russia, he is being hyper cautious. He is not prepared. In the same video, he said that he is not prepared for Poland to shoot down these cruise missiles that are headed towards Poland in that very same interview. So you can see how cautious NATO is. I mean, it's extremely cautious. So there's nobody taking any risks here. Now let's go down to Putin. And you know, I mean, my personal view, I'm not a military advisor, and I don't want anything I say to be used in any way to help anyone in this conflict. I'm a Buddhist. I've taken a vow of not killing. I can't say anything that will help either side in the conflict in any way. But just my understanding of the situation, just to help scare people, then I do not think that it would be any risk to Poland if it shot down these cruise missiles over Lviv. There's nothing that Putin would not do anything if Poland did that. Very obviously legitimate. And would make no sense for Putin to attack Poland because Poland shot down a missile that could potentially be headed for Poland. That makes no sense. But NATO is so cautious that it's not going to even permit Poland to do this. So now, let's go and look at this, at what Russia is doing about Putin. So now, some people, they say to me basically, well, Putin's mad, he's just going to do this out of pure madness. I explain all of this. I explain how it makes no sense for Russia. I think, so I have a hypothesis that this may come from playing computer games, where you play against virtual opponents that have got that just aren't sane in the computer game. They don't think like human beings. So if you've got insane opponents who are just madly attacking you all the time for no reason at all, or some very flimsy reason in the game reasoning which wouldn't make any sense, you would never, as a normal person, behave like the mad attackers in some video games. No normal person would do that. So, all the largest scheme of things in these video games. So I don't play video games, so I just know from little snippets of things I've seen them. I just look at that. That's not what human beings would do. So, so I think this may be possibly why people they think of Putin like an opponent in a computer game, but he's not. He's a real person, and he's not a cartoon character. He's not someone from a movie. He's not he's not a James Bond villain. Another example of this sort of thing. A James Bond villain does not have motives that normal people have. It's not a normal person. They don't try to round him about and make him seem like a normal person. It's just hyped up in bizarre ways. It's always James Bond for that matter, but in a very fun way. So it's just all hyperbole and exaggeration. It's fun and it's for entertainment. It is not real. So same way, these movie characters, they're not real. So Putin's a real person. He has things he cares about. He would not become the leader. He would not want to be president of Russia unless he had some reason that he wanted to particularly was interested in Russia itself and wanted to achieve something for Russia. If he just had personal ambitions to be a very wealthy person, to have a comfortable life, to have a luxury lifestyle, to jet around the world or something, he would be an oligarch. He wouldn't be the president. Or he might be an exiled oligarch, so as not to be at any risk from the then Russian president, steal a lot of money from the Russian government, go into exile and become a multi-billionaire and live a life in luxury on a tropical island somewhere. But that's not Putin. So Putin, although in a very bizarre way, he does care about Russia. He has to. That's why. He could also be a megalomaniac who's sort of, not megalomaniac, so I don't mean really. I might be someone who likes power. Someone who likes to be in charge of lots of people. But it's obvious that Putin isn't that. And he's not doing it just to be in power. He is doing it, and even if he was, then he would want to stay in power, wouldn't he? But it's very obvious that Putin is doing this because of an idea of the greatness of the Russian Empire. And he wants to, he's madly keen on Fabergé eggs. And a total price of 100 million for the ones that were bought for Russia by an oligarch friend of his. And he will talk for hours about these Fabergé eggs. He's greatly keen on those. Now, a war is not going to be good for Fabergé eggs. If NATO starts attacking Moscow or it starts attacking St. Petersburg, which is where these eggs are, then that's not going to be good for the eggs, is it? He cares about the Red Square. A war is not going to be good for the Red Square. St. Basil's Cathedral. These are sort of things that Putin wants, cares about. He doesn't care about individual people. So this is what people find so bizarre. Russians have this idea that he thinks of himself as a kind of modern Tsar. And the Russians have a kind of, now I don't know about this myself, my own experience, or from knowing what it's like to be in Russia, but from what I've read, then the reason the Russian soldiers go and volunteer in Russia, in Ukraine, and they experience such hardship and yet they continue fighting, because they have this kind of built-in idea back from the Russian Empire that they are the subjects fighting for the leader of Russia and doing their patriotic thing by fighting in Ukraine. And so they don't actually give a lot of thought as to why they're fighting. They're just fighting there out of patriotism. I'm talking about the ordinary, like the peasant level, they're not very well-educated people at an awful lot of the Russian army. They're just doing their patriotic right, patriotic duty, fighting for Russia, which they've been brought up since kids to do. And Putin thinks as the other side of this. He thinks himself as the Tsar that is ordering these Russian people to do their patriotic duty. And just like with Tsars, he does not give an awful lot of thought to the individual soldiers. And the individual soldiers don't really expect him to. They complain, their wives complain, and lots of things, and sometimes Putin takes it too far, but it's a very different ethos from the Ukrainian side of this. So then he would lose everything he's been working for his entire life. If he was just one tactical nuke in Ukraine, then the USA has told him secretly, and we don't know what they told him, but from General Petraeus and what he thinks they might have told him, he's not privy to what they said. He thinks that the US probably told Putin that that they would use conventional missiles to sink the Black Sea, to target against in the Black Sea, by which he was clearly hinting at the Black Sea fleet, and targets on the ground in occupied Ukraine, presumably all the planes and helicopters on the ground there, and command posts and things. So if Putin used one nuke in Ukraine, then within hours his Black Sea fleet, they would all have what he would probably tell on television was unexplained engine fires, and they'd all start sinking to the bottom of the Black Sea. So he knows that. Not with mushroom clouds. So the Russian people would see a television program he couldn't deny of a single mushroom cloud in Ukraine, and then they would hear on the news indirectly, not on the Russian propaganda news, and the Black Sea fleet is gone. And that would be the end of Putin's regime. So there's no way that Putin's going to do that. And he was also told by China, and then people have this idea, fantasy idea, that Putin could destroy the whole of Europe, the whole of the United Kingdom, all of NATO with his nukes. That is not true at all. Putin doesn't have one nuke for every single UK and US base even. And these bases are, of course, many of them hardened against nukes. He doesn't have one nuke for all the US ICBMs, but he doesn't have one nuke for each of the concentrations of the conventional forces. He can't do anything to stop the US nukes from their side, but they wouldn't use them in response. They would likely respond by using the F-35s and taking over Russian airspace and doing lots of unconventional non-nuclear methods to prevent Russia from using any more of its nukes because of their vast superiority in technology. So if Russia was to, he's never going to do an all-out attack in nukes. That would be total madness. He would have lost his ability to think clearly and think coherently at all. But there's no way that he could, with his nukes, they're much more dangerous than conventional weapons, but they're like a very big conventional weapon. They are nowhere near as much power as a volcano or an earthquake or a tsunami. Those are vastly more powerful than a nuke. People don't realize they're really quite small things compared with the natural forces of nature. We have nothing that approaches the amount of energy and power in an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, even quite a small volcanic eruption or quite a small earthquake. If you use a nuke, even a big nuke, it'll create a small crater in the ground, like tens of meters, maybe hundreds of meters at the most across. That's most you can do with a nuke. So, and then the radioactive fallout, it dissipates very, very quickly because it's reduced tenfold in its radioactivity every 7 times the time period increases. So after an hour, it's got a certain amount of radiation. After, say, 10 minutes, it's got a certain amount of radiation. After an hour and 10 minutes, it's got a tenth of that. After another day, after 8 hours or so, it's got a tenth of that again. After a couple of days, then it's gone back to a tenth again. And soon, nearly all the radioactivity is gone. And if you're indoors, it's the heavy dust that causes radioactivity. If you are indoors, then you are insulated from a lot of the radioactivity and the various things. We used to have these books and these instructions in the 1970s and 80s about how to protect yourself in the event of nuclear war. We don't get those anymore because nobody seriously expects Russia to use nukes. They would give us these instructions if we seriously believed it. So no, Putin's not going to use nukes. Yeah, so I have already talked about. It's not about trusting him. It's just that he's not a cartoon character doing crazy things out of incoherent madness. Indeed, every time that Putin Putin sets these red lines, after 2 red lines. His first red line, I think, was the one where he said that it would escalate in some unspecified way if Europe used sanctions against Russia. Of course, it's now got many sanctions against Russia. Russia did not use nukes. It used it against Finland and Sweden when they said that they would join NATO. And it was so serious that the United Kingdom promised Sweden and Finland that it would extend its nuclear umbrella before they joined NATO. They would use the British nukes to protect them against Russia, because Putin was threatening to attack them with nukes. And of course, they joined NATO, and Putin didn't use any nukes. And he just threatened it over and over and over and over and over and over. And if I said as many overs as he said red lines, I'd be going on probably for a few minutes. And each time the red line is crossed, then he does nothing. Now, this tells us over and over again that Putin is not an insane cartoon character who does insane things when you cross a red line. Every single time, it reinforces the message that Putin is what he seems to be, a sane but very ruthless, but someone who's able to think coherently, and who is doing these as bluffs for the very obvious reason that these bluffs are delaying NATO in supplying Ukraine with what it needs to defend itself. So of course it's much easier for Russia to attack Ukraine if NATO does not give Ukraine even its Atakams from the 1980s or the F-16s from the 1970s. So Putin says, if you supply Ukraine with Atakams with F-16s, I will use nukes. So then he is known from the past, or indirectly he suggests that by saying he'll escalate in an unspecified way. He has past experience that this will delay NATO from supplying these for a crucial few months. So that's why he does it. It's a very logical, very sane, from a ruthless, strange man. But from his point of view, it's the same thing to do. So then people say to me, but what about when Putin invaded Ukraine? And so this is not based on believing him to tell the truth. So I think I did that up here, did I? No, I'm telling the truth further down the page, I think. Oh yes, it is this actual one, sorry. Yes, so I wouldn't trust Putin to post a letter for me. He just seems, I mean, he might open the letter and read it just to see what I'd written. I don't know. I mean, I don't know anything about him as a person, and maybe for things like this he is trustworthy, but for the things that he has just proved himself to be untrustworthy over and over again in things relevant to the war. So when he invaded Ukraine, then he promised he wouldn't invade Ukraine, and then he did. So this is not about trusting Putin. The reason he invaded Ukraine was because he thought that he would be able to take over Ukraine in a few days. He had this plan to capture the Ostomol airport, and then set up an air bridge, then rapidly drive into Kiev. All the rest of what he did was meant as distraction. Then he expected this is according to various plans that were leaked since then, and then there's an article about what his plans likely were and what they pieced together what they were. And then it's believed that his idea was that he'd been assured that falsely of course, that the Ukrainian military would then defect to Russia after he had very rapidly set up this air bridge, flown over some tanks to Ostomol airport, they'd driven into Kiev, they'd take over the government, and then he thought that the Ukrainian military would defect to Russia, and then he'd very quickly take over Ukraine. And he expected to be in charge of Ukraine within a few days. And all the rest since then has been because he hasn't had a plan B. He didn't have a plan B. And so this is him improvising a plan B ever since then. So this was Putin saying something, doing something which was mistaken because he'd been very badly advised. If he'd followed the Ukrainian experts on Twitter, like I did, then he would have understood that this plan wouldn't work. But he allowed himself to be deceived. Maybe he wanted to believe it to be true, into thinking this, but it wasn't an insane plan, because he just believed advisors who were lying to him. And he believed them over the experts on Twitter from Ukraine who were telling him the plan wouldn't work. So that is very different from him attacking NATO, where Putin has always acknowledged that NATO is stronger than Russia, even publicly in Moscow on his TV. And must be very, very clear to him in this war that NATO missiles and air defense are vastly superior to US ones. So no, he cannot make that same mistake with NATO. He is not going to attack NATO, and there's a reason why he invaded Ukraine, which on paper is a much, much stronger. It's got several dozen fighter jets, while Lithuania has none, not even one. And Lithuania has the very weak Suwalki Gap from across to Kaliningrad. Why didn't Russia invade Lithuania? Because Lithuania was part of NATO. That is the only reason. So no, and then he's withdrawn his soldiers from the front line, all along the front line with NATO. So I hope this is gradually getting you, I know this is getting a little bit long, but I hope this is gradually getting you, helping you fill out lots and lots of details for those who get very worried, help you understand there's just no way that Putin is going to attack NATO. It makes no sense. And so every time Putin sets one of these red lines, and then NATO crosses the red line, then Putin does nothing. This reinforces what we've known all along, and now Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, they've known all along, and Latvia, Estonia, they've known all along that Putin is like this. They've known that he's just a big bluffer. They know that he does not carry through ever on his bluffs. So that's what he's doing here. He's just bluffing and bluffing and bluffing and bluffing. And he's been bluffing for over 2 years. And every time he bluffs, and then people cross his red lines, and he does nothing, this confirms that he is a sane, and he's a sane person who's bluffing. That he has never at any point done anything to suggest that he is an insane person, incapable of coherent thought, a cartoon character who is motivated by sheer madness and doesn't bother what happens to him or to Russia or to his soldiers, and is going to do something out of sheer madness. There's not been a single occasion in the last 2 years that he's done anything that suggests that he has a character like that. So I've never understood why people think that he is this bizarre cartoon character who will act out of insanity. And I've just been thinking since yesterday, I think, perhaps it's because of video games. Perhaps it's because I don't play video games that I've never thought this. But so if you're someone who plays lots of video games, please stop and think, and try and think, is this something a real human being would do, rather than a bizarre fictional character in a movie? And I enjoy movies, but I've watched James Bond, but I've never thought that the villains in James Bond are real people, or James Bond himself. They don't behave like real people. For me, it's a fictional, over-the-top, fun, exaggerated thing. It's not real. So do think about this. Is this a real person, or is this just fictional? And it is fictional, this idea that Putin would suddenly, after 2.5 years of being a totally sane person, who is obviously rational, he's ruthless, very, very ruthless person. And with this Tsar idea of just not really thinking about the lives of his soldiers in the way that most people do. But he is not insane. He is ruthless, rational. It's very, very different. And with these endless bluffs, the bluffs are the bluffs of a sane person, a person who can think coherently, a person who thinks in terms of actions and consequences. He may have a very limited view of actions and consequences. He may end up in the International Criminal Court eventually as a result of not having a broad enough view of this, if depending how the war ends. But he, in this short-term limited way, he is thinking in terms of actions and consequences, just like most people do. And another thing that you might think about is you might wonder, well, sometimes I have irrational outbursts of temper, say. I might just get very angry with someone for no reason. I'm not even sure why I'm angry. So what if Putin does it like that? Well, Russia, like the USA, like all the countries, there are numerous precautions in place to prevent that, to prevent Russia, Putin just waking up now to spontaneous, to say, go and bomb so-and-so with a nuke. If he does that, the generals will question him, even though they're not yes men in that sense. There are lots of precautions to prevent irrational, insane, and if he had actually gone insane, instead of just waking up, he's in a bad mood, he's not thinking clearly. But if he'd actually gone insane, then I think the generals would claim that there's a malfunction of some sort. They'd ring up and they'd say, look, Putin's mad. What's the problem with your missile? Why isn't it firing? They'd do that. And then they'd say, has anyone here got a gun? Or they'd say, has anyone got a tranquilizer or something? So they'd be whispering away and then sing out loud things to Putin to try and distract him and delay him while he remained mad. So the things you can do, even if you can't, even if you don't have anything like the 14th Amendment in the United States, but there'll still be things that the generals can do in Russia if Putin went mad, to stop him just doing things out of pure madness. But there's nothing seriously mad, nothing at all. Not even for one instant. So now I go to Admiral Radakin. So he is the chief of the UK Armed Forces, and here he's got a very good understanding of the situation on the ground in Ukraine, because the United States generals, they're a little bit dissociated from what happens in Ukraine, because the United States doesn't permit its generals to go into Ukraine to meet the Ukrainians there. Biden has travelled over into Ukraine, but the generals in the United States have not travelled to Ukraine. They have to talk to their counterparts there over video link. But Admiral Radakin, UK does permit its generals to fly over into Ukraine and talk to the Ukrainians in Ukraine. So Radakin has seen the situation in Ukraine from the ground. He's got a very, very good understanding of the situation in Ukraine. And anyway, so Admiral Radakin, he says that the biggest reason that Putin doesn't want a conflict with NATO is because Russia will lose, and lose quickly. So when the UK, when it supports Ukraine, it's got a very, very strong understanding of what's happening there, and they see no risk here at all. And Radakin, he says over and over again, he said that several times. He emphasised that Russia is not dangerous. He's not saying that Russia is not dangerous, but there are overwhelming odds that Putin would have to confront. And then he talks about how NATO has to stay strong. So NATO has to stay coherent, and it has to stay strong. Oh, sorry, I should have got a bit more from that. I think it's more about that, which will make it clearer. He talks about how now NATO's maritime force is far stronger, has 4 times as many ships and 3 times as many subs as Russia. And he talks about their air superiority. And he talks about the special military operation in Ukraine. It's supposed to last between 3 days and 3 weeks. And it's supposed to take 2/3 of Ukrainian territory. And Putin has failed in all of these strategic events. And is supposed to stop Ukraine joining NATO and EU. And the opposite has happened. Its air force has failed to gain control of the air, which, as I explained, it has seen 1/4 of its vessels in the Black Sea sunk or damaged. And that's by a country without a navy, lost nearly 3,000 tanks, over 5,000 armoured fighting vehicles. And so, before it can propose a realistic threat to NATO's eastern flank, he has to reconstitute their tanks and armoured vehicles, rebuild its stocks, and so on. And then, and he talked about how NATO's defence budget is 3.5 times more than Russia and China combined. But China is not helping Russia in this. Its GDP of NATO is 20 times greater than Russia's. And oh, that's just about recruitment. I think they missed the end of it. Yes, anyway, So yes, I should add a little bit more from there back in that debunk. And then he ended by in his speech by saying that that so long as we keep strong and together with NATO, there's no way that Russia's going to attack us. So in that bit that I just read out there, he talks about how Russia is nowhere near ready to attack, even if it wanted to right now. And of course, NATO has to be think about the future, but they're ramping up there. I talk about the Rapid Defence Force of 40,000. They're ramping that up to 300,000. So that is more. That's a third more than the army that Russia assembled to invade Ukraine in 2022. That will be just the Rapid Defence Force, like instead of the 40,000. If Estonia needed help to defend Narva, then by a few years from now, it will be able to call up 300,000 soldiers. And the usual ratio is 3 to 1 of the attacker to the defender. So that would hold back nearly 1 million Russian attacking soldiers. And it's just there to hold the front line until more of the 3 million NATO soldiers can get to the front line to join them, if Russia was to keep up with it. I mean, I think it's inconceivable that even years from now that Russia really attacks NATO. All that NATO has to do is to stick together, and there's then no way that Putin is going to attack them, no matter what happens, no matter how this war ends. So, so that's it. I think that's the end of this video. Yes, I've disabled the comments because I get people who read the title and then they just answer, and so they might read this. What is the title? They might read that, and they might just fire back and say Ukraine has no right to self-defense or whatever it is, some silly thing that shows that they have never read the article at all. So that's why I disable the comments, sadly. I used to get sensible comments, but then, I mean, I still do. I get lots of sensible comments. So I'm sorry for those of you who make very sensible and important comments on my articles. But I have to think about the scared people. And I started getting these comments because I think my articles got a bit more popular. They started getting shared a bit. They end up sometimes turning up in the Google search results, and they end up in people's crawler feeds. And then because of that, then I get people just coming to these articles who haven't read them. They just look at the title. They're not the people I'm trying to help. They're not the people who read my articles carefully and ask me thoughtful questions at the end of it. They're randos on the internet who just come across this article, and maybe they're pro-Russia and they just don't believe any of this, and they say lots of bizarre things, and then I have to answer those for the scared people, or delete them, which I don't like to do. But if they're there and then deleted, that also scares people. So that's why, sadly, I have to disable the comments. So do join. So as I say at the end here, at the end of the article, for more help, well, you can see the list of my debunks. There's my short debunks, which is a new thing. And then please join our Facebook group. And we very much welcome you. Also, if you're a fact checker or a debunker, you're just able to help people who are scared. By maybe you've got some experience in the care industry, in the National Health Service, for instance, in the United Kingdom. Maybe you are good at helping people who are panicking and scared, and you know what to say to help them. And then a lot of the people that we help are seeking help from psychiatrists. Some of them are not able to get help from psychiatrists, so we help people who are very scared. They're often, most common ones are autistic, or they are bipolar, or sometimes people with obsessive compulsive disorder too cause problems for them. I think an awful lot of them also have no psychological problems at all. but they are very empathic or imaginative. And then they hit these articles. So we did it's just an informal one of these things where you get people to run a test and see how imaginative and empathic does it say you are, and then they answered, and they voted saying as to which they were. Whether did they come out as an empathic, imaginative person? Quite a higher than the expected proportion come out as empathic and or imaginative of the ones who are scared. And then whatever it is, if you get very anxious and you can easily develop an anxiety disorder from things like this, from the fake news and the false stories and the exaggerations and from Putin's bluffs and believing them, and the people who exaggerate those bluffs for all sorts of reasons of their own that are not genuine. And so, if some of you may have developed a panic disorder, or an anxiety disorder, so we help lots of people with anxiety disorders, and so there are lots of things that therapists can do to help. And so many of them are receiving help from therapists, but they still need the fact checks, which therapists can't do. So we work together. But unfortunately, we can't talk to the therapists. It's not normally permitted. But if any of you are able to are involved in helping scared people, and there's a lot of you can help a lot just by reassuring people who are scared and giving a bit of advice about if they're trying to find difficulty finding a therapist or anything like that. That can be useful too. And just we welcome anyone who can help with either the fact checking of any of this, or helping people who are anxious, or who can just by ordinary ways helping people. Sometimes some of our members are suicidal. If you're used to working with people who are suicidal, then you might be able to help as well with that. And just to explain, in ordinary ways, try to help people in many ways. Just help them to help them with whatever it is that they come to it with needing help for. Then we welcome fact checkers, and we help people who are scared by these stories, and in any way you can help. So do join our Facebook group if you want to help with the fact checking. So yes, I should add there, and please also help if you can help in the other ways. I just forgot I usually copy and paste over from. Yes, I need to add a section there, which I've got in some of my copies of this section, but I'm not sure why it's not in this one. Also if you're good at helping people who are scared and panicking and so on, then you're very, very welcome as well. And be sure to check the rules before posting or commenting to help the group to run smoothly. So, okay, let's hope that this week I'm testing a new microphone. Let's hope it works. So we'll see how this goes. And I'll upload it assuming it's okay.